the heart of this nation, under skies so blue,
there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true.
From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe.
Can a judge really, tell the president's administration what to do?
Well, that's a fundamental question, isn't it?
Yeah, and what happens when those orders seem to clash? It's the core of this really fascinating legal and political story we're diving into today.
Absolutely.
We've got some news articles and also some pretty vocal online reactions, all looking at this recent friction. It's between a federal judge and the Trump administration over deportation flights.
Right.
So our goal for you today, our mission, if you like, is to really understand what went down. What were the legal arguments being made?
And what are being made, potentially.
Exactly. And get a clearer picture of the different ways people are seeing this whole thing unfold.
Yeah.
Trying to cut through some of the partisan shouting.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable how quickly something like moving people across borders touches on these huge questions about, well, how our government is even set up.
Mm-hmm.
What these sources show, I think, is a real tension. It's right at the heart of the separation of powers.
Okay, so let's dig into that initial conflict point then. We've got Judge James Boasberg, he's a federal judge, and he took the pretty significant step, right, of initiating contempt proceedings against the Trump administration.
A big step, yeah.
This was all centered around those deportation flights to El Salvador back in March. So what exactly triggered this? What did the administration supposedly do, or maybe not do?
Well, Judge Boasberg's contempt proceedings, they basically stemmed from his assessment, his view, that the administration showed, and this is his term, willful disregard for a previous court order.
Willful disregard.
Yeah, related specifically to those March 15th deportation flights to El Salvador.
Wow.
So, in essence, he felt the executive branch knowingly chose not to follow a directive from the court.
That's not a minor thing.
No, not at all. It really speaks to a potential challenge to the judiciary's authority itself.
But like you said, the legal process, it rarely just stops there, does it?
Hardly ever.
The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit then got involved. So what was their role here? What did they do?
Okay, so the D.C. Circuit, they issued a temporary halt.
Temporary?
Exactly, a temporary halt to Judge Boasberg's contempt proceedings. And it's really vital, I think, to understand what that means.
Right.
It wasn't a ruling on whether Boasberg was right or wrong, or on the actual merits of the administration's appeal. Instead, it was more like a pause button, a temporary pause, a procedural step.
Just to give them time.
Yeah, basically to allow the appeals court more time to really consider the arguments the government was making.
Okay. And this is where things get, well, even more scrutinized, maybe. Because the appeals court panel's decision, it wasn't unanimous. It was 2-1, a split decision.
That's right.
And our sources, they make a point of noting the judges involved. The two in the majority, Judges Katsas and Rao.
Trump appointees.
Right, appointed by President Trump. While the dissenting judge, Judge Pillard, was an Obama appointee. So what can we, or maybe what should we, infer from that alignment, if anything?
Well, you always have to be cautious, right? You can't draw definitive conclusions just based on who appointed a judge.
Sure.
But, these kinds of differing views, often along those lines, they can reflect these broader debates we see about the judiciary's role and how legal principles get interpreted, especially when cases are politically sensitive, like this one seems to be.
So the fact that the split fell along those lines.
It's definitely something observers are noticing.
Yeah.
As they try to unpack the legal reasoning behind the decision and the dissent.
Okay, let's circle back then to the core issue that started all this in the first place.
Right.
Those deportation flights to El Salvador.
Right.
What was the specific legal challenge there, or the concern that brought the courts in initially?
So the ACLU got involved. They went before the court arguing to block what they called imminent deportations to El Salvador.
Imminent, okay.
They wanted a halt to those removals.
Right.
And then during a hearing, you had the Deputy Assistant Attorney General Drew Ensign. He stated that, well, no flights were planned for that immediate Saturday. But crucially, the administration reserved its right to carry out removals the very next day, on Sunday.
Okay, so they kept the option open.
Exactly. And that reservation, that likely fueled the legal challenge because it suggested they still intended to deport people.
Right. It wasn't a guarantee they wouldn't. And it looks like Judge Boasberg, at a certain point, maybe felt his hands were tied.
Yeah.
The reporting suggests he acknowledged he couldn't actually act on the ACLU's latest motion at one stage. What was limiting him there?
Well, it seems like the specific legal arguments in that newer ACLU motion, they maybe didn't meet the necessary legal standard, the threshold,
for
Judge Boasberg to intervene right at that specific moment.
Yeah.
Courts need clear legal grounds to issue orders, and in that instance, perhaps those grounds were seen as insufficient by the judge for that particular action.
Got it. Okay, now let's shift gears a bit and look at how different sources are interpreting all these events, because this is where we see some really strong opinions coming out.
Yeah, definitely different takes.
Townhall.com, for example, they characterize Judge Boasberg as a, quote, rogue judge.
Strong language.
Very, saying he's overreaching. They even bring up past situations where they claim the Supreme Court had previously, quote, spanked him on similar deportation flight issues.
Right. They connect it to past events.
Which is quite the accusation, isn't it?
It is. The town hall perspective is clearly one that views Judge Boasberg's actions as going beyond, well, the proper limits of judicial authority. They argue his order to turn around planes, which, importantly, they describe as carrying terrorists, was unlawful.
Okay, that framing is key.
Yes, and that it was an infringement on the executive branch's job, its responsibilities for immigration and national security.
And the reference to the Supreme Court.
Their reference to prior Supreme Court actions suggests they believe this isn't like a one-off thing, that in their view, this judge has overstepped in this area before.
And we're seeing similar strong reactions online, too, right, on social media?
Oh, yeah.
Mike Davis, for instance, he calls Judge Boasberg a D.C. Obama judge, says he got slapped down.
Echoing that narrative.
And he also brings up this idea of the previous Supreme Court ruling limiting the judge's jurisdiction, specifically in, quote, MS-13 deportation cases.
Right.
It really sounds like there's a narrative building there, doesn't it? A politically motivated judge being sort of reined in.
Yeah, these social media comments, they really amplify that argument. The idea that Judge Boasberg's actions come from political bias, not sound legal judgment.
And that word jurisdiction keeps coming up.
It's key, yeah. Jurisdiction just basically is a court's power to even hear a case, right?
Right.
So the implication in those comments is that Judge Boasberg didn't actually have the proper authority, the jurisdiction, to make that initial order about the flights.
Especially, they argue, because of supposed prior Supreme Court rulings.
Exactly what they're implying.
Then you have Margot Cleveland's tweet, which seems maybe a bit more straightforward.
Yeah.
Just pointing out the administrative stay granted by the D.C. Circuit.
Right, which is, as we discussed, just a factual update on the procedure.
A confirmation of that temporary pause.
Exactly. A straightforward reporting of the procedural status.
And then finally, that town hall article, it concludes by saying the Trump administration, quote, expected this nonsense from, quote, left-wing and egomaniacal judges. That reveals a very, very critical view of the judiciary from that source.
It certainly does. That statement really sums up the broader feeling in that town hall piece. It's a belief that certain judges are acting out of, well, ideological opposition to the administration, rather than just applying the law neutrally. It frames the whole legal challenge as basically political obstruction.
Now, it's really crucial for us to stress here as we present these viewpoints. We're reporting on the content from our sources. We aren't endorsing these characterizations or the pretty strong language being used sometimes.
No, definitely not.
Our aim here is just to help understand the different ways this whole conflict, legal and political, is being seen and talked about in public.
That's exactly right. And the strong rhetoric you see in some of these sources, it just highlights how charged this issue really is. So for you, the listener, it's important to just recognize these statements as representing specific viewpoints within that wider discussion.
Okay, so let's try and summarize what we've unpacked here. We had a federal judge initiating contempt proceedings over deportation flights.
Right, Judge Boasberg.
Then those proceedings got put on hold temporarily by an appeals court.
The D.C. Circuit, yeah.
And we're seeing this wide range of reactions, some sources very strongly criticizing the judge's actions, calling it overreach, maybe politically motivated.
While others might see it as necessary judicial oversight.
Right. The central tension really seems to revolve around that balance of power, doesn't it? Between the judiciary and the executive branch, especially when it comes to immigration.
Precisely. What this deep dive into the sources really gives us, I think, is a pretty vivid snapshot. It's an illustration of that ongoing, often pretty contentious interplay between the courts and the White House.
Especially on sensitive stuff like immigration.
Yeah, where legal principles and, let's face it, political priorities often bump up against each other.
So it leaves us with a really interesting question, maybe, for you to think about. Since that appeals court halt is only temporary.
Right, not final.
What do you think might be the next steps?
Yeah.
Legally speaking, in this whole back and forth.
Good question. More appeals. Back to the lower court.
Could be. And maybe bigger picture. What does this whole episode suggest about those ongoing debates we always seem to be having about executive power and the absolutely essential role of judicial oversight in our system of government?
Yeah, it puts those debates right back in the spotlight, doesn't it? Definitely something to keep an eye on going forward.
In the heart of this nation, under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true. From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe. Conservative values in our souls, they're interweaved. With courage and with honor, we'll hold our ground. For freedom, for tradition, in this land we found. Cherish our Constitution.